Hello. This podcast is part of a series of podcasts that develops the topics that were taught in the first revision session, which was on the birth of the Weimar Republic, 1919 to 23. The first couple of podcasts, which hopefully you've now seen, were about the German Revolution. This will be the first of two podcasts that will look at the Weimar Constitution. The second podcast, the one that will follow on after this, will focus in on the strengths of the Constitution and the weaknesses of the Constitution. This first podcast, though, will explain how the Constitution worked. But first, I'll just give a little bit of background to it. Okay, so looking at the points on the slide here, we saw at the end of the previous podcast that Germany was declared to be a republic. That happened on the day the war ended, which was the 11th of November 1918. Now, let's just be clear exactly what that means. Before 1918, in fact, for the best part of 45 years or so, Germany had been an empire. Now, an empire is a country that is ruled by an emperor, and an emperor is a monarch. Okay, like England today, we have a monarch. Our monarch is a queen. What does a monarch mean? A monarch means that the head of state inherits their position by birth. So an emperor an emperor rules an empire, and the German word for emperor is Kaiser. Now the German word, the Kaiser of Germany from 1890 and throughout the years of World War I was a man called William II, or in German Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now the system of government in the German Empire, which came to an end at the end of World War I, was what in history we would call an authoritarian system. Now, an authoritarian system basically means that a lot of power is based at the top of the system, particularly in the hands of the emperor himself. So if you try to imagine a sort of pyramid structure, you've got the emperor at the top. At the very bottom, the base of the pyramid, you've got the people, 40 million Germans. And effectively, if you have an authoritarian system, such as was the case in the German Empire, the people at the bottom have very, very little power. Real power lies with the emperor. Now, with all the problems that were building up during World War I, the people became increasingly unhappy with that situation. And so, as we saw when we looked at the German Revolution, by November 1918, even though it seemed that Germany was winning the war, the people at home were disgruntled, were unhappy with 4 years of mounting pressures. And so on the 9th of November 1918, the Kaiser, the emperor, stepped down from power. He didn't want to govern Germany anymore, so this was a great opportunity to create a new system. So, as we saw in the German Revolution podcast, you have the German parliament called the Reichstag, and the leader of the largest party was called the Social Democrats, and the leader was a man called Friedrich Ebert, stepped in and did the brave job of saying, I will be the new head of state temporarily until we can work out a new system of government. And so he stepped in and he declared Germany to be a republic, which is the first point on the slide here. Just tick that point off. Now, it took 2 months before they were able to develop a constitution. Hebert said, look, it's wrong for me, one person, to decide on the way in which the new Germany will be run. He declared that he wanted it to be a much fairer system with power from below. In other words, power lying more with the ordinary people, rather than at the top of the pyramid of power, so to speak. And so he said, we've got to have an election, and that took 2 months to organise because he had to wait until the war had ended and soldiers could return home and vote. And what was elected was a new parliament. It was called the National Assembly, or the Reichstag. And the first job of the new Reichstag was to draw up the constitution, which were the rules of the way in which government would work from now on. So how did this work? Okay, well, first of all, instead of having a emperor whose power was based on birth at the top of the pyramid, you now have a president. Now, the president was elected. If you look at the bottom of the pyramid here, there are the people. All citizens aged over 20 have the right to vote, and that actually included women as well. Now, the citizens were given a Bill of Rights, and that was an incredibly a very, very important document across the whole of the world. It basically guaranteed basic human freedoms to the German people. Now, the German people had never had such freedoms. They had the right, freedom of speech, the right to freedom of welfare provision, such as an unemployment benefit, and lots of other rights, but particularly the right to vote, and that included women. Now, even in Britain at this time, which was seen to be one of the freest countries in the world, women did not have the right to vote. They didn't get that until 1928. So Germany went from being a system in which the people had very little power to a system in which the people had a huge amount of power almost overnight. So that was a very, very liberating, very exciting experience for the German people at the end of the war, that they were given those rights. Now, what the Constitution said is there was a president, a bit like the old Kaiser, who was the head of state, but unlike the old Kaiser, he did not get his position by birth. He wasn't born into power. He was voted directly by the people, and that happened every 7 years. Okay, so that's the first strand of the Constitution. The second strand of the Constitution is the people would vote every 4 years, and it's there, for members of Parliament. Okay, as we do in England today, but the Parliament in Germany was called the Reichstag. As you can see, the Parliament was the representative assembly. It was the assembly that represented the people. And the Parliament, the Reichstag, was the main lawmaking body. Okay. Now, roughly speaking, there were about 500 what we call deputies, or who had seats in the Parliament. And that's where real power lay. So again, looking at the diagram, that's what these upward arrows mean that you've got here. Those upward arrows are basically saying power lay at the bottom of the pyramid with the ordinary people. They are choosing the president, they are choosing the Reichstag. Now, 500 people can't form a government. You would never get agreement, you would never get decisions made. So the way the system works, and it's very similar in our own country today, is they would look at the 500 members of the Reichstag and they would belong to different political parties representing different views, which is fine. It's a free country, you've got different views about how to run the country. And as we saw in the opening session, those views will be spread along what we call a political spectrum. There will be some left-wing views and some right-wing views. Left-wing views argue that more influence should lie with the poorer people. Right-wing views would argue that if you work hard and you can make money, then wealth is nothing to be ashamed of, and people with money, the middle classes, should be able to have influence and power. So it's all degrees of influence along that particular, what we call political spectrum. And basically the way it worked was the president would look at the Reichstag and he would find the political party that had the most support in the Reichstag, and then that political party would be invited to form the government, and the government was this organisation here, which usually was about 12 men, which was basically the Prime Minister, the main minister, and 11 other ministers. In England, we call the main minister the Prime Minister. In Germany, they called the main minister the Chancellor. Okay, so as it says there, appointed by the President, but the government could not make laws without the Reichstag voting yes to the laws. So the government's job was to present a proposed law called a bill to the Reichstag, and for the bill to become a law, more than half the members of the Reichstag had to vote yes to it. So basically, if there were 500 members of the Reichstag, then basically 250 or more members had to vote for it. So effectively, because the Reichstag was chosen by the people, that means it was the people who were effectively running the country. Now, finally, just to quickly finish off, the voting system was a system called proportional representation, which was a very, very fair voting system. So again, if you got 500 seats in the Reichstag, and let's say there are, for argument's sake, 5 political parties as shown here, if Party 2 gets 40% of the votes nationally, then Party 2 will get 40% of the seats, which would be 200 seats. If Party 3 gets 20% of the vote, then they will get 20% of the seats, so they will get 100 seats, and so on. So Party 4 would have 150 seats, Party 5 would have 5% of the vote, and so they would have the appropriate number of seats as well. So effectively, every party, no matter how small the party, would have some seats in the Reichstag. Okay, so 5% of the seats would actually be 25 seats. I think I've got my maths right, because 1% of 500 is 5. 5 times 5 is 25. And over here, Party 1 would have 25 seats. So even though they're very small parties, they would still have 5 seats. Even a party that had 1% of the vote would still have 5 seats. They'd have a few seats of the 500. Now, what that basically meant is that there would be lots and lots of political parties in the Reichstag, that the seats would be spread fairly thinly across lots and lots of parties. So it would be unlikely that one party would have more than half the seats for themselves. Now, remember what we said earlier, to get laws passed, you've got to basically get 50% of the members of the parliament behind you. So with this one, you wouldn't be able to get one party to vote to get laws passed. So therefore, when the president was appointing a party leader to form a government, he would probably approach Party 2, because Party 2 is the largest party, but the leader of Party 2, to be able to govern, would have to basically team up with the leader of Party 3, because between them, 40 plus 20, you have more than half the seats. And so the government will be a combination of members of Party 2 and Party 3. And that's what we call a coalition government. It's a government that consists of more than one party. It's a very, very, very fair system. This system of proportional representation. So I'll stop at that point. That's the end of this first podcast, and go on to the next one that looks at the strengths and weaknesses of this system. Thank you.